My name is Jim Harrold. I'm a data services engineer with Nation Builder. I've been with the company for about 3 years. And what I wanted to tell you about today was a little bit of an unusual case study. It's one of our most popular data products, our national voter file, but as often as we possibly can, we give it away for free. And we do that because we're trying to democratize access to this kind of data across all campaigns in the country. So first, I'll explain a little bit about Nation Builder. I'll go through what the voter file is, the raw data that we're working with, and why Nation Builder decided that we had to build our own national voter file. Finally, I'll explain how our partnership with Trifecta took this from kind of a nightmare project to a reliable product that we were able to regularly update and produce for campaigns. So first off, as a data services engineer, I work with customers that are new to Nation Builder. I help them get their data imported and hit the road. Inevitably, when people break their data and do things that they didn't mean to do, I'm part of the team that goes in, fixes it, explains what went wrong, and helps them not to do that again. But the reason that I'm here today is that I'm also on the team that refreshes our national voter file. Nation Builder is software for leaders, and so chiefly our customer base is made up of political campaigns, activists, student organizations, but we deal with pretty much everybody, even down to neighborhood organizations. In the past election, we did serve over 3,000 different campaigns across all levels of government and across the political spectrum. And one thing that they all rely on is the ability to contact voters and drill down very deep into their potential constituency. So, in order to help that happen, they use a piece of data called the voter file. The voter file is basically a nationwide registry of every active and inactive registered voter in the entire country. It's updated shortly before and then almost immediately afterwards every election. And campaigns use it to know who they're going to talk to. It's the beating heart of any political campaign. So you will often see data sets that are used by campaigns, especially the RNC, NGP-VAN, and other political data companies that just have an incredibly rich offering where you can drill down into a voter's preference, their attachment to certain issues, and how strongly they feel about whatever's going on that day. But the beating heart of every single one of these data sets is actually provided by the government. Voter files are administered at the county level. And we observed that there was a lot of trouble on the part of smaller campaigns and people who are running for the first time to actually access this data, which is a pity because it's incredibly important. Every voter file has a unique ID that attaches to one voter. It has that voter's contact information, some of their address data, their registered address and mailing address, and it lists every single political district that they live in, from the nationwide level, their congressional, state house, state senate districts, all the way down to their city council districts. Most importantly, it has their political affiliation and their voter history. Now, everything that I've just told you, there are exceptions to these rules state by state. For example, Hawaii doesn't even have a unique ID system. We had to build it ourselves. I just couldn't be bothered. And some states only give you 1 or 2 years of voter history, while others give you data going back as far as 1970. When you combine this with the other information in the voter file, it's a really powerful way to understand quickly what your constituency wants and what issues are probably most important to them. So, given that this is a really powerful tool and every modern American campaign runs on it, why did we feel the need to build one for ourselves? Early on in the company's history, when we first started onboarding a lot of our political customers, there was a conversation that we found ourselves having over and over and over again, especially with smaller campaigns and people who didn't have a really big war chest. We would onboard them, we'd build up their website, they'd start emailing people they believed were their supporters, and then they'd come to us and they'd ask us if we had a voter file, and we'd say, no, we don't, just go over to your county office or your Secretary of State office and get it for yourselves. And they would tell us that they simply couldn't access it. And generally, the reason why broke down into one of 3 categories. First off, they were running against an incumbent inside their own party. Someone somewhere didn't want to see that incumbent lose, pulled strings, and they weren't able to access the voter file. Secondly, they were part of a political party that wasn't supported by the people who control access to the voter file. Again, someone somewhere pulled some strings and they simply couldn't access it. Finally, they were a new campaign, they were inexperienced, and they didn't have a lot of money. And they were living and operating in a state where the voter file can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And on their own, they had to make the hard decision between being able to pay for their staff and organize their volunteers versus just having this data. And they were trying to do without it. And any political campaign that tries to do that, tries to run without a voter file, is crippled. So we saw a system where major political parties were asking these smaller campaigns, or campaigns that just couldn't access it, to compromise somehow, to say a certain thing, or not run at a certain time just to get this data. And Nation Builder's mission in the political world is to lower the barriers of running for office as much as we possibly can. For every candidate of every political stripe, we want to see more leaders so that we can start cultivating a better class of leadership. So we decided to build a voter file ourselves. We did run into some problems almost immediately. The first one is that voter files can be very, very difficult to access because there's no law saying that they should be easy to access. The most relevant federal legislation that governs the voter file is the Help America Vote Act of 2000, which simply tells every state to maintain a voter file. It doesn't say what should be in there or who should be allowed access to it. So states were left to decide that for themselves, and a lot of the time they would delegate that authority down to the county level. So going county by county, one or two counties could just say, no, I don't want to give you the voter file, and there wouldn't be a lot that you could do about it. Beyond that, there was no hard and clear rule saying what kind of data has to be in the voter file. The fields that I told you about earlier, the unique ID, the contact information, the political districts, and the voter history, that results from a general understanding between the major political parties, the major campaigns of the day, and Secretary of State offices. And that understanding was reached 20 years ago on the understanding that these parties needed to be able to run mailing campaigns. So pretty much everything about the data structure of the voter file is out of date. And we realized that we had a lot of work to do to acquire this data, standardize it so that it was in a format that our customers could easily use, and then get it out to them. Finally, when it comes to the actual districts, every state and sometimes every county within a state has their own version of what I call district logic, which is how they decide who lives in what district and how they decide how to put those districts into their voter data table. For most states and most counties, they simply put everything onto one row, which that's the ideal. That's what everybody should do. You should be able to see one person's unique ID and then every single district that they live in. Other states break it out. I think Colorado is one of the worst offenders. They actually have their voter file with the basic contact information. They then have one table that gives you the general code for each district. So this code means congressional, this code means state senate, so on and so forth. And then a separate table, which only relates to the second table that I mentioned, that gives you the specific name of each district. All those things are also encoded, so you need yet another table to break through that code and see, oh, this is Congressional District 1. To come to that realization, I would have to use 3 tables from Colorado. And just to make things even more interesting, all of this is broken out by county. So multiply that by 50, and you get an idea of what we were up against. We decided that we couldn't do what we wanted to do, which was make one superscript that could take any state file, process it, rename all the districts into something that was human readable and that our customers could work with, and then give it out to anyone who needed it. Each state would need one single script that was highly customized and that had to be regularly updated because all the information that I just told you about also changes over time. The only constant that we could find in the voter file was a thing called a precinct. That's the lowest denomination of political district. It's used by counties to organize who's going to go to what church or what school to actually submit their votes. And you can break down even a congressional district into its constituent precincts. So this is the district that most campaigns are very intensely concerned with. They need to know who's in what precinct to know where to send people who are going to knock on doors and where to send their phone banks to call. But it's also districts with the most fluid naming structure. Some precincts have a very highly regulated naming system based on numbers. Some are a set of pretty systematic alphanumeric strings, and some are based on the places that people are sent to vote. So you could have a precinct that's named after a church, a precinct that's named after a school, what have you. And a lot of times, again, this information is further encoded for whatever reason. So these scripts had to be very, very detailed and be able to drill down deep into the data to make sure that all of these crazy naming structures were turned into something that people could easily use. So I wanted to give you a quick idea of some of the worst offenders when it comes to accessing voter data. The one that drives me personally crazy is the state of Alabama. If you want the state of Alabama voter file, you have to go to them with a $30,000 check. That's the baseline price for that data. You cannot get it at the county level. We even tried to pay by credit card and they wouldn't accept it. You have to send a check. And once you pay for it, you don't just get an FTP download, you get a CD in the mail 2 weeks later. Yeah, it's pretty painful. Again, multiply all of this by 50. The second one that drives me crazy personally is Arizona. Every voter file is built at the county level, and what's weird in Arizona is that the information is piped directly to the statewide parties. The assumption is that if you're running for office in Arizona, obviously you're already affiliated with one of these parties. So if someone is an independent or is just trying to get this voter data to redistribute it, you get a lot of suspicion, and it's very easy for any one county recorder to simply deny your request. There's nothing saying they have to give you this data. Finally, our own home state of California. Sorry for anyone who has traveled out here to be part of Strata. Welcome to California. It has its own problems. You can pay $25 and just get one single statewide file, but you're actually getting 58 different files because the statewide office doesn't make any effort to systematize the lower than county district levels. So once you get into the file and look at districts at the county commissioner level or anything lower, each county's own naming convention is simply preserved, whether it's encoded or not. And if it was encoded, then they just paste on the table that you need and you have to do all the work yourself. So you're getting 58 times as much work as you thought you were going to get. And again, multiply all this by 50. Each state has its own weirdness and idiosyncrasies that we have to account for. And to give you a better idea of what district logic is, let's take a look at Ohio, New Jersey, and Nebraska. Ohio has a great range of districts and everything is pretty well named and organized. You can go all the way from congressional districts to state senate and state house, all the way down to precincts. New Jersey doesn't have quite as good of a district content, and everything is named differently from Ohio. And finally, Nebraska is kind of a weird case. We know that there are school districts in Nebraska. We know that there are something akin to township districts because we see customers running in those districts. But for whatever reason, the statewide file simply doesn't contain that data, and we've never gotten a clear explanation as to why. Every state has weirdness like this. So we had to build our scripts very, very carefully to account for every possible idiosyncrasy in every possible state, and within those states, every possible county. That effort took us the better part of 2 years. It involved the full-time efforts of 5 engineers with Ruby and SQL specialization and the full-time efforts of 3 data researchers, and I was one of those original researchers. We did some math one time, and we calculated that in terms of the time invested into the script that processes the Pennsylvania statewide voter file, it costs about $13,000. So the way that things work now is that we've set up a partnership with a data processing company called Trifecta. And what Nation Builder brings to that relationship is all the research that we've done into understanding each and every one of the state files and each and every county file that's contained within it. We've already done a lot of the hard work, and we're already doing the harder work of getting this information out to campaigns so that they can themselves get a raw file and generally know what they're working with. What Trifecta brings to the table is the ability to process data much, much faster than we could simply throwing Ruby scripts at everything. So they give us a tool called the Data Wrangler, which if you've worked with Stata or SPSS, you have some idea of what you're getting into. It's a web-based interface that combines a live script editor using a custom Python-based transformation language and a small sample of whatever data set that you're working with, which is loaded into the web-based interface so that you can edit your script, and as you're making edits, see what it's doing to that sample. This cut out an amazing amount of time that we had to spend before kind of spelunking with SQL, running a bunch of scripts onto a raw voter file to see what had changed and what we would need to do to change our Ruby scripts to keep it up to date. With Trifecta, we are able to combine the process of exploring a data set to see what changed and updating our script to make sure that it still works. So again, this saved us an enormous amount of time. And the best part is that Trifecta is totally based on AWS, which besides the AWS apocalypse a couple weeks ago is really reliable, and that took down about half the internet, so we're not going to hold that against Trifecta. I wanted to give you a quick before and after so that you could understand just how big of an impact using the right tools for this kind of job can have on your workflow. This is what we did when Nation Builder was trying to process all this data by ourselves. We would acquire the voter file, which, as I've mentioned before, is kind of a nightmare. We would have to pull it into one team member's local SQL instance and run script after script after script to get an understanding of what had changed between this instance of the voter file and the most recent one. We document that elsewhere and then make a checklist of everything that we'd have to do to modify our Ruby scripts to make sure that when we process this voter file, it would come out as the product that we expected it to be. And the Ruby scripts were designed to do basically 3 things. They go through, they do all the district logic that I explained earlier so that you end up with 1 row per voter that contains all of their districts, and all those districts have the same naming convention across the entire country. It also does the same transformations for our voter history. And voter history, state by state, is again processed very differently, and you never know quite where you're going to get. So we can wind up with one single row per voter that has all of their history, which is incredibly useful for campaigns, as I've explained. So we'd have to load this voter file into a local server that we ran ourselves and then run the Ruby script on it after making a lot of painstaking edits to that Ruby script. And this work could only be done by engineers because the Ruby scripts got very, very long over time. They had to capture each inconsistency that the state introduced to the voter file, as well as store all the old inconsistencies, whether or not they were still there, just in case the state decided to bring them back. It was a really painful process, and on the largest state files, like Texas, which clocks in at around 12 gigs, running the Ruby scripts in our local server could take as long as 2 days. And if you found out halfway through that you'd made a mistake and you'd already kicked off the job, well, you'd have to do it again, and your week is shot. So with Trifecta, I want to give you an idea of the time that we were able to save. We can just acquire the data, we can load it into the Trifecta AWS server, pull it up in the data wrangler, and again, combine that process of exploring the data set to see what has changed with modifying the script that you're going to use to process the entire thing. Also, we are able to kick that script and that data set, once we're confident that it's ready to go, over to a dedicated Hadoop cluster, which does all the hard work of processing the data for us, again on its own AWS instance, and then spits us back a complete voter file, along with a lot of information about the idiosyncrasies of that voter file, a lot of measurements about things like the number of active voters, how many people voted in a recent election, how many people there are in each district, information that we'd have to run individual queries ourselves before. So the time saving is just phenomenal. Plus, Trifecta has been working with us to introduce a smart system that catches little errors in the formatting of the districts that we don't have to look for it ourselves. So in conclusion, the whole reason that we're doing this is that the government has kind of failed to do this for themselves and to make it easy for people to run for office. And to be fair, some states do have phenomenally simple and very easy to access voter files, and some states do have phenomenally difficult and easy to access voter files. What made us want to do this is that there is no hard and fast rule telling a state that they have to give a political candidate data. And that's something that we wanted to do for ourselves. And this work involved a combination of just brute force research, taking over 1.5 years with a lot of resources thrown into the project, and finding the right tools for the job. I'll be honest, by the end of the research process, we took a lot of pride in what we were able to do. And we were kind of unwisely attached to the Ruby script and local server process. And it wasn't until we started running the same files on Trifecta that we realized that we're just going to have to do better and go with the tools that can get the job done. So that is the story of how we went from trying to refresh one single statewide voter file in about 2 weeks' time and doing the entire nation over 6 to 9 months to being able to regularly refresh the voter file every single quarter. Any questions? Okay, thanks, folks. Oh. I do see a question in the back, sorry. Yes. They're just not going to do it. That's something that I forgot to dive into, actually. A lot of municipalities in California, Los Angeles among them, will keep paper records of the ballots that someone submits. And the voter history that you want isn't who a person voted for, it's how they voted and what elections they voted in. And instead of digitizing that information, California cities just print out huge, huge boxes of paper records. And they don't want to store that, so about 6 to 9 months after the election, they just set it on fire and incinerate it. And the only people who keep this data are private companies. And right, it's more about just saving space. Yeah, budgetary reasons. Yes?
Can we use your data to cross-check to see if there has been voter fraud? There's people voting in one state and then doing it in another state?
We potentially could. The state file ID system that I mentioned is only unique within that state, and some states do use a similar system, so you would have to account for that. But what you would want to look for isn't so much one single person doing it. You'd want to look for inconsistencies in the number of voters that you would expect to participate in an election versus the number of voters that actually participate in an election. So if I saw election history saying that the entire population of a certain county in a certain state had participated in that election, I would call fraud. And the normal voting population is about 1/3. Yes? Sorry, I didn't hear the end of that. Yes. Sure. So the key there is that we make very sure that we abide by each state's laws for how this data has to be distributed. We give it to political actors, people who are going to use it in elections, and we ask them to make sure that they're abiding by those laws as well. And I'll be honest, the legislation around how this data is used is still very much in the gray. It's new. Like I said, the most recent law that deals with this is from 2000. Yes?
You can't get data that you feel like you should.
Mm-hmm.
I bet the ACLU would help you.
We haven't gone that far yet.
But I bet they would.
It's really cool to think about, actually. Yes?
How's the process to keep this data? If they change from the source, like once they change the way that you keep the data, how do you keep it?
Sure. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, DC, which is one of the voter files that we get regularly, decided to remove their unique ID system. They didn't give us a reason as to why. They were just taking it out entirely. I think it had something to do with somebody's concerns about privacy. So what we had to do was get that voter file as soon as we possibly could and build our own unique ID system off of it, and then run test after test after test, comparing it to the old file and getting as high a probability of match as we could. And I'll be honest, we lost data. There was no way to avoid it when you're trying to build your own unique ID system. But you just roll with the punches. It's like dealing with bad weather. You can't control it, and you just do the best that you can. Anybody else? Thanks again for coming out today, folks.